You may have already seen the video on screen presented by a rather handsome young man suggesting a list of beginner corals that are not boring. It's one of my most popular videos, watched by over 150,000 of you lovely people. And today it's time for the sequel, so I've compiled a list of what I consider to be the 8 best corals for intermediate reefers ready to take the next step. Now I'll explain what I mean by intermediate after the list, and I'll explain why you might be ready for these corals even if you still consider yourself to be a bit of a noob. And if it's your first time here and you want a weekly dose of reefing goodness, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out when I upload. First up is the artist formerly known as Acanthastria, which have since been renamed Micromusa lordhowensis by a bunch of nerds in lab coats. They're a beautiful fluffy LPS coral, some of which have more hues than Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. What makes these corals intermediate is that they require low light and can lose their colourings if you overcook them, which is easily done with modern powerful LEDs. Despite that, they're still hardy enough, and they will accept some aquarium food such as pellets, which is a great way of helping some LPS corals recover from ill health. Number 7 is Leptoceris. There are a few colour varieties, but none match the rather unique brilliant orange and green of the jack-o'-lantern. It's an encrusting coral that has a rather flappy skirt at its edges, and it has very small sweeper tentacles, so technically it can sting its neighbours, although at the risk of insulting my coral's masculinity, they don't seem to do much damage. They're also readily available as hardy aquacultured frags as opposed to wild caught colonies, which means you'll get a coral used to aquarium life and therefore more likely to survive and thrive. Next up is a slightly unusual furry LPS coral called Leptostraya. It's another encrusting coral, so probably a good candidate for isolation on an island to stop it taking over your rockwork. Although I find it makes pretty slow progress and its growth speed is more tortoise than hare. And they don't have sweeper tentacles, so they won't wipe out anything in a 6-inch radius, unlike some corals on this list. This is called a John Deere Leptostraya, presumably because it was discovered by a man on a tractor, or because of its green and yellow colourings. Who knows? All I know is it's an awesome intermediate coral, and you should get one. In at number 5 is a classic LPS, the Duncan coral, which does sound a bit like a 6-year-old train driver from Gloucestershire. Now, it's not as colourful as the other corals on this list, but it scores highly on the wavy movement front, as well as hardiness and availability. Frankly, you could throw a stone in your local fish shop and probably guarantee you'll hit a Duncan coral, which should mean they're cheap, like the budgie. Of all the corals on this list, Duncans probably have the best shout at qualifying as a beginner coral, so they're probably still worth a punt, even if you class yourself as a noob. Number 4 is Trachophilia, also known as Trachys. Now, this is the only coral on this list I haven't kept, so I won't opine on its care requirements, save to say that they're generally considered to be easy enough to keep. And if you've got the cojones to risk a large amount of cash money, you can get Trachys in some of the most stunning rainbow colours. And their fleshiness and growth pattern make them a great candidate for a centerpiece coral. And there are less spectacular but still pretty awesome colour varieties available if you don't fancy shelling out half a mortgage payment. First on the podium then is chalice corals, and chalices have some of the most mind-blowingly bright and varied colours in the hobby. I've found them to be a little more fiddly to work out in terms of placement, and some, like this aptly named Raja Rampage, have long stinging tentacles that mean it will need to be placed a safe distance several inches away from its neighbours. Now, that combined with its relatively modest light and flow requirements make it a great candidate for placement on your weir box, which is an underused area of coral real estate in most tanks. For my number 2, I'm going to cheat and include a group of corals known as euphyllias. For the purpose of this list, that means frog spawns, hammer corals and torch corals. Although they have stinging sweeper tentacles, they won't sting each other, so can be kept together as part of a garden, with the exception of torch corals, which are about as aggressive as chalices. Low to moderate light and flow is the order of the day, although torches probably favour a little more of both. And it's really torches that make this entry so high at number 2, because they can be just so damn stunning. Although of course with great colour comes great price. But if you can't stretch to a few £100s for a single head, you should probably be able to pick up a reasonable sized blue tip green torch for well south of 100. And my number 1 intermediate coral is the Scalemia. While green and red corals aren't exactly scarce in the hobby, there is nothing quite as beautiful as the bleeding apple scully. Under blue LEDs they glow brighter than almost any other coral in the hobby and have absolutely mesmerising patterns. Scullies are also very hardy, and you can recover a 6 scully back to health just by feeding it. In fact, such is its hardiness, it's often cited as a beginner coral. In my opinion, it isn't quite beginner level because many experienced reefers suggest it doesn't do well long term above 77 Fahrenheit or 25 degrees C. But if you're looking for a centerpiece coral without the worry of an expensive purchase dying, this is about as safe a bet as you'll get. Now, at the start of the video I said I'd tell you what I mean by an intermediate reefer. Well, you don't need a degree in marine biology or even 2 years experience in the hobby, and I simply mean you'll have to have had your tank up and running, ideally for 6 months or more. You'll need to know what your key parameters are by testing alkalinity, nitrate and phosphate weekly, and ideally have at least a rough idea of your tank's PAR levels. You'll need to know about dosing and the basics of keeping stony corals, to include a bit of knowledge of coral warfare, placement and lighting and flow requirements, all of which can be discovered using an excellent reef keeping website called Google. So there's every chance you consider yourself a beginner, but in reality you meet the criteria I've set out for intermediates. And all corals on this list are still fairly hardy and forgiving, so they can come back from the occasional near-death experience, which is what makes them reasonable candidates for intermediate reefers or even beginners with a higher degree of testicular fortitude. If you enjoyed the video then give it a thumbs up and subscribe for next week, and until next time, happy reefing.